order. This is a Borough Assembly meeting March 1st. It's a special meeting to go over the budget. The clerk call the roll.
Jay?
Here.
Kurt?
Here.
Cindy?
Don't know if she'll be here or not.
Eric?
On his way, I've heard.
Yeah.
Mark?
Here.
Bob?
Here.
Nancy?
Yes.
Okay, we have a quorum. We'll get started. It's now time for the voluntary Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, first item on the agenda is, are there any visitors in the audience that have views related to items on today's agenda? If there is, you need to come forward and state your name and who you represent, and we'll have to move the microphone over there, I guess, Jody.
I'm Barbara Fish, and I represent, I guess, a citizen of Petersburg. I'm also on the library board. But I just have a quick question, and that is, looking at the proposed budget, a lot of what was the criteria for decreasing or increasing the amount of the expenditures for the different departments? I noticed that some are a lot lower than the year before, and some are higher. And specifically, the library and parks and recreation are a lot lower in expenditures. And at the library board, we've talked about the budget. But I was just curious what the criteria is.
Okay, well, it'd probably be best for the finance director to explain that to you.
Sure, and I will,
I'll sit down.
I'll address some of that during my presentation, so if that's okay.
That's fine.
And then, again, every department head does do their own budgets, so it's not like we say, okay, you have to go hit 10% under your last year's budget or something like that. So it's dependent on each department.
Okay, so maybe we'll get that information budget by, or department by department if there's a question. Any other visitors with views related to items on today's agenda? Okay, seeing none, we will proceed. And new business, the first item is a presentation of the proposed operating budget for fiscal year 2017.
Okay, and if it's okay, I'm just going to sit down here, and if you have any questions and I can't see you, just shout out to me and I'll stop. The budget process until now, in November, the Assembly reviewed and approved budget policies to help guide us in the budget process. In December and January, the department heads put together their budgets. I compiled the budget based on the department heads' proposals and presented it to the borough manager. The borough manager reviewed the budget and made some changes, and the manager's budget was handed out to the Assembly on February 11th. So you've had it since then. There has been one change to the budget. You should have found it underneath the PowerPoint presentation. It was to the harbor. The payroll numbers were entered incorrectly. They've been adjusted about $55,000. So today's presentation, we're going to go over the general fund budget, significant changes in revenues and expenses, challenges facing the general fund, enterprise funds and new capital projects, and special revenue funds. I'll give an overview of each fund and review changes, but I'll also be including how each fund may be affected by the potential state of Alaska funding cuts. I will not be going line by line through this presentation. You will notice that I will be focusing the most on the general fund. This is because the general fund is more at risk from state funding cuts than any other fund in the borough. I will save the motor pool department for Carl after my presentation. And next Monday, the Assembly will be meeting to discuss community services more in detail. So in the general fund, the budget is balanced with a $23,000 surplus budgeted to go back to building up the reserves. To get to the surplus, $90,000 was cut by the borough manager in various departments, $5,000 in admin, $7,000 in finance, $45,000 from police department, $6,000 from community development, and $25,000 from public works. This budget is based on what we currently know or have been told regarding the state of Alaska's budget. The state most likely will not have their budget approved before the new fiscal year begins. Once the state's budget is finalized, we may be doing a supplemental budget to make changes or budget cuts to account for any state cuts in borough and or school funding. General fund budget policy. Looking at the graph, you'll see the number of months of operating expenses and unreserved fund balance. The increase in 2014 was from the double payment in PILT. That's right. I don't know if it's going to let me. Hold on for a second. Right in here was from the double payment in PILT that the borough received because of a timing issue after forming the borough. In fiscal year 15, the Assembly approved transferring the budget surplus from fiscal year 14 of $950,000 to the Property Development Fund to use for the municipal building, police, and jail renovation. In 2016, which we are currently still in, the Assembly approved to transfer out $1.1 million to use for the municipal building, police, and jail renovation. So general fund revenues. As you can see, 63%, right here, all of this, of the general fund is supported by local taxes. 8% is charges for services. This would be things like the overhead paid to the general fund from the enterprise funds for benefits that they receive, parks and rec fees, revenues that we bring in, what else? Ambulance fees, things of that nature. 16% is the state funding, like the fisheries tax, community revenue sharing, state PERS relief, DOT airport security, the 9th officer program, and the jail contract. And then 11% is federal funding, such as the CCAD investigator and Forest Service Special Services Agreement and the SRS and PILT. General fund revenues. On page 12 of your budget, you'll find the general fund revenues, which reduced 1% next year compared to the current year's budget. Property and sales tax will remain flat. We've increased the tobacco tax revenue from $200,000 to $225,000. We're estimating that we'll at least be bringing in $225,000 this year. Decreased state community revenue sharing 30% from the prior year. This reduced amount was given to us by the state of Alaska if there was no contribution to that program. And Steve, they just decided today that that's
hopefully
right.
There's a pickup. Yeah, we just got an email from Kathy Wasserman at AML that the House Finance Committee has zeroed that out. So the lower number, at least at this point, is what will be offered up, which is what we've already budgeted for. If the governor's budget would have gone through, we would have received a little over $100,000 more. So from a budgetary standpoint, we took a more conservative approach.
And just for the record, Member Logadakis is with us, so we have 6 assembly members now. Okay, Jody?
Okay.
Hey, Jody, can anybody just a minute?
Yeah.
Hey, Steve, maybe for the benefit of the audience here, could you tell them what we generally get in the way of community revenue sharing and then what this looks like in the 30% decrease for this one year?
We normally get $530,000, and it's interesting because we budgeted for the lower amount this year, which is $340,000. But when we became a borough, let's back up. When we were a city, we received about $340,000. When we became a borough, we got an additional $200,000 a year more. So we're back to where we were before. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very
Okay.
much. Yeah.
Decreased state jail contract by 40% from prior year's actuals. We are budgeting to use $500,000 of Secure Rural Schools funds, which they're located in a special revenue fund for schools. This current year, we're using $600,000. So we're decreasing the amount by $100,000.
Jody, if you could explain why. that one?
Sure, this is to help decrease our future reliance on secure rural schools funding to support our schools, as this federal funding might go away at some point. It hasn't been reauthorized for next year. We should be getting another payment in the next month or so. On page 14 of your budget, starts the expenses. This chart shows us what departments are taxes and state and federal funds, where they're going. So you can see the top 3 expenditures in the general fund are public safety, general government, and the schools. General fund expenses. So on July 1st, general fund PMEA employees will receive a 40-cent negotiated pay increase. That's the same throughout the borough except for IBEW employees, which is the electric fund. They'll be getting a 2% raise. There are no raises in the budget for department heads. So HR budgeted for 15% increase to the borough's health insurance premiums. All general fund departments' expenses have remained flat or decreased except the following. On page 14, there is an increase in assembly budget by $10,000 for hosting the Southeast Conference next fall. On page 15, information technology, we're budgeting $30,000 for new equipment, licensing, and Microsoft Office 365. $5,000 of it is for licensing and to move from our CDP backup devices that are no longer going to be supported by Microsoft to the cloud. And $25,000 is for the Office 365. Page 20, community services. And I'm skipping through the budget. I'm just, again, going over significant changes. So if there's something I'm skipping that you might have a question on, just stop me. There was an increased funding request from KFSK of $8,000. They're requesting a total of $19,000 through the state cuts in public broadcasting. And since putting the budget together, we've also had a request to help with WAVE funding of up to $46,500. Other notable general fund expenses, $80,000 subsidy to the assisted living. We've budgeted to transfer out an additional $100,000 to the municipal building renovation project. And this will help us not have to, if we do have to borrow money from the electric fund, it hopefully would not be as much. We're just trying to build that fund balance up. And then $35,000 to replace aquatic center lighting. And Donnie, do you mind talking about your aquatic center lighting project?
So I placed a set of information at everybody's desk there that talks a little bit about that lighting project. It's been an issue since the facility was technically built. A couple of things that we're running into is, number one is we usually go through anywhere between 25 to 50 light bulbs a year in that facility. At $22 a piece, that adds up to a pretty healthy chunk. Now, comparatively, in the gymnasium area, which we have about the same number of light fixtures, in the last 4 years, we've actually only replaced 15 bulbs. So that can kind of tell you the difference of what we're working with here. We have a couple of issues that are causing that. Number one is that the amount of power for these lights to light that aquatic center is increased because the lights are turned upside down, and so they're facing the ceiling. And so all the light has to go through all the HVAC systems, all the bars, everything, and then try to reflect itself off of the ceiling and then back down into the aquatic center itself. But most of that lighting gets lost, especially since when the facility was built, it was painted yellow, which is not a very good reflective color. And so it causes us issues. And then the other issue is that when they were built, a lot of the light fixtures, you can see in some of the pictures that I've shared with you guys, aren't even possible for us to get to. And so we can't replace those lights and those fixtures at all, which causes us a lot of issues during swim meets. It makes the facility really dark. One of the assumptions that people had hoped would be that we'd have a lot of natural light with those side kind of windows that we have. The problem is that we all know we live in Southeast Alaska where we don't get a whole lot of light. And so it's kind of dreary. So that causes, it's all of these issues all combined, which have brought us finally to the point of saying, okay, we're spending a lot of money on electricity in this facility, spending a lot of money on replacing light bulbs. We're spending a lot of money on not being able to actually change specific fixtures, and so it's time for a change. We saw a dip in the amount of electricity that we actually spent once we changed all of our lighting in the gymnasium about 4 years ago. And we expect for this to happen in the aquatic center as well as cutting our costs on light bulb fixtures. So we're looking for $35,000 this year. We budgeted that, and that even with that $35,000 that we budgeted, we are still below what we spent last year in our budget. And so that needs to be taken into consideration as well. But we expect this project to be something that will help us to start cutting back our electrical usage as well.
Do you have any idea the magnitude of the cut you might see in electrical costs?
We've looked at a couple of different scenarios, but until we know exactly how many lights that would actually replace what we have right now, we don't have a firm number.
Well, what was the reduction in the gymnasium?
On average, it was about $200 a month.
So we're $2,400 a year.
Mhm.
So you're talking about, just on the electrical cost, if it's anywhere close, you're at, 10 to 15-year payback.
That sounds about right. You'd also have to take into consideration the cost of, anywhere about, $1,500 to $2,000 in the light bulb cost too.
Thank you.
Any questions on that?
Yeah, Johnny, these
Kurt?
are the LEDs then?
That's the plan, yes.
Okay, so your replacement cost there would be very low.
Yeah.
Judy, the $100,000 you're taking out of the general fund, is that above our 6 months operating expenses that we want to keep in reserve?
No, this falls within the budget, which we have a surplus of 20-something thousand.
Okay.
Any other discussion on the lighting for Parks and Rec before we continue? Okay.
Okay, I want to look at this chart again and talk about challenges facing the general fund next year. There are 3 threats that I see affecting the future of the general fund budget. It's the state funding cuts, which would be here, right? And the federal funding cuts, and possible federal funding cuts, and the increase in the senior citizen population and how is it affecting our largest source of income, which is our local tax revenue. I'll focus on that first. In 2010, there were 181 seniors claiming a senior exemption on their property taxes. In 2016, there are 285 seniors claiming a senior exemption on their property taxes. This is an increase of 57% over 6 years. And our overall population is not growing, therefore our tax base is shrinking. The biggest jump in the number of applications was between 2013 and 2014. That's when we became a borough. So you'll notice it increased 42 applications, but 25 of those were due to forming a borough, and the other 17 were in Service Area 1. And then as you can see, it remains consistent, about 17 application increase a year. And just a reminder, this exemption is an unfunded mandate from the state of Alaska. The state does not reimburse the Petersburg Borough for this lost income.
There's one thing they're talking about in the legislature right now, that giving that responsibility to the boroughs or cities, that it's up to you if you want to implement that. So it was started by them and funded by them for a couple of years, and then unfunded for them. So now it's going to be up to us potentially to.
Well, it would be up to the voters.
Right, up to the voters, yeah.
And who is the biggest or what category of seniors make up the biggest part of the people that vote?
Right.
So,
The tax is a property tax. Is it a private property tax or how is it defined legally?
you have to be over the age of 65. It has to be your permanent place of abode.
I'm not talking about the exemption, I'm talking about the property to which the resultant tax is levied. It's levied against all property, warehouses, vacant land. The exemption is on residence.
Yes, correct.
We're also exempt, what other private property in the borough is being exempted from the tax? The tax is a tax, it's not a tax on houses, it's not a tax on land, it's a private property tax, or, how is the tax defined in the statute?
I would have to look at the statute.
Basically what I'm a boat owner, I live on a boat, so I pay
Right.
no property tax
Right,
whatsoever.
right.
Okay, my boat is personal private property. We tax cars, we tax trailers, we tax everything in this town except boats.
Well, we don't tax cars or trailers.
Well, the state does.
No.
Levies a fee on it. You're correct there. But some boroughs tax all the property in the borough.
Right. A lot of communities in Alaska tax boats.
So you've not included that lost revenue in your calculations, the lost revenue on the assets that are sitting around here right now. I'm talking about my boat, all the other yachts.
Right, that's not included in the
But
property
you're
tax.
talking about lost tax revenue.
Yes.
Isn't that another revenue source that should be compared with this one as well?
You're talking commercial fishing boats and gear and et cetera, everything besides.
Commercial, private,
Right.
whatever.
I think,
Maybe next year I'll do a couple slides on that, but we would all actually have to have the assessor come in and assess all that so we would know the value of them.
Boroughs do access.
correct, and then we're,
At the point now, when most of the marinas around us are full, the lost revenue of people leaving is, nobody likes to pay taxes. I'm a senior
Right.
and I live on a boat, so, I'm just free right now. But, if you're going to talk about the lost revenue from one particular tax structure, perhaps we should consider all of them. Because
Right.
you're not taxing boats.
Right.
Your
But you can
state's
understand
making-
how that could be hard to do since the vehicles are not, we have no idea. We don't take inventory of them like we do houses. We'd have to hire the assessor to do that, and that would cost an additional amount of money.
Cindy, you had your-
You have good points, but I think in Jody's presentation, she's just trying to compare like situation to like situation, and the thing that has changed is the
Well, I
amount of
think
seniors.
We're looking at revenue sources.
We need you on a tax committee.
Yeah.
currently we're looking at what's
Absolutely.
presented to us today,
Sure.
and if that's a new thing we need to look at is taxing different entities, that'll be a different topic. But so we need to keep moving along. Nancy, did you have a comment?
Yeah, don't we,
And we'll get we need to get recognized from now before we speak, so we're not having this ongoing dialogue.
Don't we get a certain amount from the state for licensing on vehicles here? A
Yeah, about
small percentage of-
$30,000 a year.
So it's tiny. But seniors there again are exempt from, on one vehicle, so.
Okay, Jody, where were you
Okay.
talking about senior exemptions?
So just in dollar amount, it would be almost $400,000 in 2016. Senior sales tax applications, 43 new sales tax exemption cards were issued to seniors in 2015. 7 new cards have been issued so far in 2016. Estimated that there are 495 current active senior sales tax exemption cards being used in the borough today. $334,000 in sales tax is not collected due to the senior exemption.
Could you break that down to food and other things?
Not today.
Let's, excuse me, sir, we're getting a presentation to the assembly to approve the budget, and there's a section in there to view visitors' views related to the agenda, so we need to keep it for what the purpose of the meeting is
If
set
you
to be.
provide me with questions after the meeting, I'll be happy to answer them. Okay.
Okay, Jody.
State of Alaska funding threats to the general fund. As I mentioned previously, we have budgeted the state community revenue sharing to decrease to $340,000, which we know now to be accurate. We have lowered the state jail contract funding to $173,000. CCAD grant. This is actually federal money that gets passed through the state for this program. It helps pay for a drug investigator position. There is talk that we might lose this funding, but it's uncertain. It's still in our budget currently right now. We have budgeted fish tax at $600,000. The general fund will keep $250,000 and the remainder will go to the harbor if approved by the assembly in the budget. The state requires municipalities to help pay down the state PERS unfunded liability. Municipalities have been capped at a 22% PERS annual contribution for this purpose. If the state was to increase this by 1%, the general fund would pay an additional $27,290 per year. The total borough would pay an additional $48,000 a year. We have heard the possibility of a 2% increase. I believe that came back with you guys from your last trip. This would mean about $55,000 increase for the general fund. This additional expense has not been added to the budget. Federal funds in the general fund. Federal PILT, payment in lieu of taxes, provides for partial compensation for communities with federal property within their boundaries and being unable to develop, own, use, or tax that property. The prior year payment was about $600,000. Currently, we should get another payment in June of around $550,000. PILT has not yet been reauthorized for next year. We did budget for it in our 2017 budget. The payments go directly to the general fund. Secure Rural Schools, $1.2 million annually. To provide timber-dependent communities funding to replace lost revenues from timber cutbacks in the 90s. This funding, enacted in 2000, was supposed to be transitional in nature, while legislation was approved to establish a timber policy, and that was environmental and economically sustainable in nature. This still has not happened. It is authorized that we will get it again this year in 2016. We haven't gotten it yet. Usually we get it in January. I'm thinking this month probably. I don't know exactly how much that's going to be. It should be around the same amount. And in fiscal year 2017, the program has yet to be reauthorized. So these payments will go directly into the special revenue fund, and then we transfer back, next year we'll transfer back $500,000 from that fund to the general fund to help in paying the school.
Jody, if you could speak a little bit about that fund balance in that area?
Sure.
What we've done with that money in the past.
Sure, there is about a $3.6 million fund balance in that fund. If we get another 1.2, it'll take it close to $5 million. We are kind of reserving it, starting to, I don't want to say stockpile, but creating a reserve so if in case that funding goes away, the general fund's not going to have to find $500,000 immediately to make up for the lost revenue for the schools. Also, the schools sometimes use it for capital projects that they have, and they can use it for. So, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I think the key issue is that's not a general fund account in the sense of that we're funding borough operations from. That fund balance has been put there so that we have a little bit of flexibility. If the program goes away, we can keep the schools getting the same amount they're getting immediately, right until we have a chance to come up with a better plan. With that kind of a balance, we have a few years that we can go through so that we don't have to have any knee-jerk reactions to our schools. Their funding, and Erica can speak better to it than I can, happens so far in advance with teacher contracts and program design that they're not really situated, and they're, by statute, can only keep so much money. What ends up happening is they can't respond to cuts in funding as easily as we can. So this account actually allows us to, the community as a whole, to have the flexibility to deal with that kind of a problem if it's happening. So, thanks, Jim.
So, and I just wanted to make you aware of these things because, you know, that as the state and the federal government are talking about these things, you'll get more of an idea of how this is going to affect us locally. The good news is the borough is in a position that has time to make changes carefully and thoughtfully. This is in part due to borough formation, which increased revenues in the general fund. It increased PILT revenue. It increased our tax base. It increased community revenue sharing, which we talked about. And we also established a tobacco tax. These additional revenues have allowed us to transfer money to capital projects, transfer more of the fish tax out of the general fund to the harbor, assist in subsidizing the assisted living facility without significant cuts elsewhere. So that is basically the general fund. Do you have any questions about that before I move on to enterprise funds?
Any questions of Jody in your presentation so far? Doesn't look like it.
Okay. The department heads have anything they want to add that I left you out?
I have something for you, Jody.
Oh.
The, some of the variables with state and federal funding, you don't have to answer it specifically, but as far as contingencies for some of those variables, if they do not come through or various amounts of those monies come through, I imagine as finance director you've given that some consideration of what a supplemental budget may look like in that event?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, so you don't need to get into specifics, maybe for people listening.
In fact, I showed Bob a copy of the list. I have a list going of possibilities. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Enterprise funds. Enterprise funds are used for services provided to the public on a user charge basis, similar to the operation of a commercial enterprise. The borough has 7 enterprise funds. As you can see, 90% of their operating revenues is from user fees, so they are obviously not as dependent on state funds as the general fund. Their biggest challenges regarding state funding is this. If the state cut loan or grant programs that they use to fund their capital projects with, or the other concern is that if the state increased the 22% cap for funding the PERS unfunded liability. On the following slides, I talk about each enterprise fund. I'm going to note how each enterprise, how that increase in PERS would affect each of those funds. Expenses. As we go through each enterprise fund slide, you will notice that there is an increase to the 22% PERS expense as we go. So as you can see up here, payroll with all the enterprise funds comprises about 25% of total expenses. If I had the same thing for the general fund right here, another pie chart, half of the pie chart would be payroll expenses. So the PERS contribution, the unfunded liability, that increase, that would affect the general fund the most. So the electric fund begins on page 25. There are no rate increases budgeted for fiscal year 2017. IBEW employees will receive a 2% raise on July 1st. Electric funds planned for capital projects, $20,000 to auto load project. This is an ongoing capital project to continue to upgrade and improve the system reliability and reduce outages. And more detail of this project can be found on page 50 of your budget. $190,000 to the Power and Light headquarters building remodel. This can be found on page 64 of your budget, the capital project, in case you have more questions on that. And $327,000 to the hydro penstock clearing project. And this is a new project that will cut back second growth trees, remove danger trees, and establish basic road, maintenance road for the hydro. Another capital project budgeted for next year for the electric department will be a 350 genset replacement. This project can be found on page 65 and is to replace the aging emergency genset, which is having reliability issues. Funds will be transferred from other completed electric projects to pay for this project. It is estimated that at the end of fiscal year 17, the electric fund will have a cash balance of $5.2 million. And 1% of the PERS unfunded liability contribution would equal $8,371.
So Jody, I have a question. Is that the hydro penstock clearing project? Is that Blind Slough? Okay. Thank you very much.
Any other questions for Joe? The Water Enterprise Fund. On page 28 of your budget, you will find the water budget. Rate increase of 2% will go into effect on July 1st. PMEA union employees will receive a 40-cent pay increase on July 1st. And again, for the remainder of the enterprise funds, this remains the case. I probably didn't put it in their slides because it would be so repetitive. Transferring out $40,000 to the Cabin Creek Dam capital project, and this can be found on page 63 for more information. This project will result in the resurfacing of a badly eroded spillway at the City Creek Dam. This is required by the State of Alaska Dam Safety Program. The Water Department was hoping to take advantage of a $380,000 USDA loan for the remainder of the project. If they go forward with this plan, it will require the approval of registered voters in the borough because it's a loan.
That 40,000 was for the design and for the grant, is that?
Essentially, it's for preliminary engineering report and environmental report to be able to apply for the loan through USDA.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Carl? Oh. So in fiscal year 2017, the budget should result in an increase to the water fund's cash balance of approximately $36,000, estimating to end fiscal year 2017 fund balance to be $904,000.
Quick question for you, Carl. What's the likelihood of getting that $380,000? I mean, you're probably going to come before us and go, we don't need to spend this 40 because we didn't get the grant. So.
Well, the likelihood of getting the money from USDA once we apply is very high. I don't know the likelihood of getting the issue past the voters.
Okay.
What are the terms of the loan?
They have not been offered yet. They're generally long-term loans at low interest. DEC is generally 20 years at 1.5%. I think this will be similar.
And the reason why you can go for a DEC loan is because they don't offer that for dams?
Yes, the DEC's grant loans program don't touch dams.
Another follow-up, Mr. Mayor.
Sure.
Carl. So if we don't do anything to the Cabin Creek Dam, what's the longevity of that dam and the reliability of service water to the community?
Well, just to clarify, this is the City Creek Dam. This is the smaller original dam, and it is our secondary water source. It's our backup, which is pretty important considering if Cabin Creek, if we have issues with the pipeline and we need to pig the line like we have in the past to restore flow, we need a backup source to go to. We can't be without a raw water source for more than a day for obvious reasons. The town needs water, we need fire protection, etc. It's something that we really need to do. The state has put a spotlight on it through our periodic safety inspections that are required by the dam safety program. And it's just been problematic finding the funding to repair the issue. But something we need to do. Longevity right now is kind of up in the air. It's continually eroding just from water going over the spillway. So that concrete is going away, and it seemingly in the last few years it's eroding quicker than it had been in the previous 20. So the age of concrete may be a factor in that, but it's something that we need to address.
Yeah, so it sounds like a little PR once the funding does become available. then I think we'll be able to convince the public that it's probably a necessary project. So, thanks, Carl.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you, Jody.
Wastewater. Yeah. Is there any other questions for water? Okay. Wastewater. Rates will increase 4.5% on July 1st. As always, they have many capital projects planned. Capital outlay for fiscal year 2017, machinery and equipment, $15,000. This is for a screening device for the composter. The sewer lines, $15,000. This is to replace sewer lines on Excel between 7th and 9th Street. I think they're planning on replacing these because they're hoping to pave some streets around there. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay. And wastewater treatment plant composting upgrades, $170,000. This capital project can be found on page 66, the budget also.
Jody, if I could jump in.
Yeah.
Chris or Carl, could you speak to why we have to do composting? It's not just because we're trying to be nice.
Right, that is correct. The reason we're getting into the composting is obviously in the wastewater system we have byproducts that we have to take care of somehow. The end result of that process is a sludge that we had been putting in cells, basically holes up at the landfill. And this last spring we had an issue with the spill that caused us to reevaluate that process, and we immediately shifted towards composting as a way to dispose of the sludge and hopefully eventually to end up with a beneficial product to the community, to reuse the material as fertilizer and stuff like that. Part of the money for the screening equipment is to help with to produce a finished product. The majority of the money in the composting upgrades is to set us up with concrete slab work and equipment so that we can be more efficient with producing this compost. But it's something we have to deal with. As long as we're treating wastewater, we have sludge to deal with, and we can't be putting it in the landfill any longer.
Thank you, Carl.
And then they have ongoing pump station projects, which are,
I don't. Sorry, Carl, but I just had this thought in my head, and there's no other way of disposing it other than doing the composting. I mean, we already know we can't put it in a landfill. Other communities, do they send it out on a barge? Is there? Of course, we all know that's going to add the expenses. So this is probably the most cost-effective way of getting rid of that sludge.
It really is. There's many ways to deal with it. Shipping is definitely one, but that's very expensive. Incineration is another, but building an incinerator is extremely expensive. This is really the best bang for our buck, and to get a beneficial product, hopefully someday, to use in the community is kind of a win-win.
Thanks for your work there, Carl.
Thanks, Carl.
so the ongoing pump station projects, they'll be funded with ADEC grants and loans. I think they're all ongoing right now. The pump station 4 force main project replacement, that's the replace the corroded force main at Hungry Point with ADEC grant and loan proceeds. Due to capital outlays, the fiscal year 2017 budget should result in a decrease to the wastewater fund's cash balance of approximately $115,000. This will bring the total fund balance to a little over $1 million. Sanitation, on page 32, you will find sanitation department's budget. 2% rate increase scheduled for July 1st. For capital outlay, they just have $20,000 to machinery and equipment. That's actually regular garbage cans, not recycled cans, regular cans. They're short on a few different sizes. I hope you're getting some of the smaller cans. Okay. The sanitation department falls short of the borough's target budget policy of 6 months of operating expenses, which is about $500,000. However, it looks like the fiscal year 17 budget will increase the balance back up by approximately $57,000.
Jody, I've got a question. Of all of these, most of these enterprise funds, you see a increase, and that was done by, scheduled in a study, right? A few years back?
Yes.
So these are
There
not,
was a rate study done,
Right.
and then
So
the
just-
assembly approved these rate increases for the next 7 or 8 years.
just to remind people, and people if they're listening, that they'll know that those raises were planned years ago.
I'm having mouse issues. Sorry for a second. It's not moving.
Is it break time?
Is it? Well, I can just try like that. Harbor Department, no rate changes currently scheduled. Harbor rates are budgeted to recapture 13% of depreciation in fiscal year 2017. Harbor is becoming extremely reliant on fish tax to help build reserves and pay for any capital projects. And why is this important? Because the state could cut the fish tax to communities. Do you mind if we take a break just so I
No,
can
that's fine. Yeah, we'll take a
get my mouse to
5 or
work?
10 minute break until the equipment's up and running.
They budgeted $350,000 for fiscal year 2017 in fish tax. They also budgeted capital outlay, $12,000 for a new security camera server. Theirs died this year. Rebuild dock project adjustment adjacent to the harbor office. This is $340,000. Ed, can you explain what exactly that is?
Yeah. Between the harbor office and Trident Seafoods is the old approach to the North Harbor, which has been abandoned, and now there's a new approach. That is the decking is about, I'm going to guess 60, 80 feet. But a third of it has been condemned because it's, once you look underneath, it's the joists and beams have literally rotted away and will not support any more weight. And we use the remaining 2/3 for parking our flatbed. We once had the waste oil dump on the condemned part, so now we have it on the corner at the end of our parking, at the end of our building. So we're hoping to get all this fixed so then we could relocate that out back to where it originally was and get that out of the parking area.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Does anyone have any questions about that? Red?
Bob, did you have a question on that?
No, well, I have another question, but I'll do that later on this whole budget. But I'll come back to it.
Is that something that's been gone through, Ed, by the Harbor Board? Is the Harbor-
Yes, it has.
Okay.
It's actually ready to go out to bid on July 1st.
Thanks.
And then we have another $65,000 for our Middle Harbor anode installation. The fund balance is approximately $2 million in the Harbor Department right now. Elderly housing, page 36. There's a wait list for the facility. Rates will go up 1.4% in June of 2016. The federal government sets those rates. Elderly housing capital outlays, water heater conversion, $22,900. This is their big project. Continuing window replacement every year for the last few years. They have budgeted about $10,000 to replace windows in the aging facility. $9,000 for carpet and vinyl. And other miscellaneous replacements totaling $15,000. They're a little bit more in detail, broken out on in your budget on page 37. I sort of clumped some of them together for the slide. Fund balance is $556,641. And I have $591,000 on there. So I have a discrepancy of my notes about $40,000. So I'll look into that when I get back to my office. On page 37, The assisted living facility, there's a wait list for that facility. Rates will increase in the fall. The state sets these rates, they're Medicaid rates. The general fund will subsidize this fund $80,000 this year. And that's besides also we bill the property taxes for the debt service to pay they have debt service payments of approximately $180,000 that will be paid in fiscal year 17.
Judy, what was our subsidy for the last couple of years out of the general
Last couple
fund?
of years, it was $50,000 this current year, $50,000 last year, and $100,000 the prior year before that.
Thank you.
There are capital outlays. They have the carpet vinyl replacement, $7,000, faucets, appliances, $6,000, portico design and repair, $58,000. This is to fix the entryway concrete footings that have been settling since construction. And the fund balance, $236,000.
This is on the older portion of the building, the portico design, or is that?
No, the assisted living facility is the newer building.
Wow.
It's that, where you drive under that since construction, it has been
That's not that
sinking.
old, is it?
No. And actually there was, I believe, a lawsuit against the contractors, and they ended up paying the city $90,000.
If I may, this was
Yeah.
before my
a long time
time,
ago.
so I'm going to be very careful. Kathy might even be able to remember this, but the money was put into the general fund, I think, by the assembly or the former city manager, that would have dealt with this. And the assembly at the time, again, or somebody decided not to get this fixed at that time. We've seen continued settling there, and now it's to that point where we either need to fix it or remove it to keep it from being a danger.
So is that something that's going to go out to bid, Steve, you're planning on, or not going to be?
We've used Alan Murph and Susan Harai to do the engineering on it, and when we get to that point of actual construction, we'll send it out to bid. We're not there yet. We've got an engineer's estimate of $58,000, and we're getting closer to that.
Okay.
Kathy, did I say anything wrong? No. Thank you.
Putting her in the hospital. Thanks. Just for the record, Member Castro is with us now, so we have a full assembly. We'll continue on.
Okay, on to the special revenue funds. They start on page 41. Special revenue funds are established by a government to collect money that must be used for a specific project or purpose. On page 42, you'll find the miscellaneous grants. Those are things like library grants, Parks and Rec grants, smaller grants. Economic fund is found on page 43. We're continuing to budget for the fire sprinkler loan guarantee program. None of the downtown businesses have taken advantage of that program yet, but they'll have a little bit more time to do so if they choose. On page 44 is the National Forest Receipts Program. This is where the Secure Rural Schools funds go. There is, again, like I said, a $3.6 million fund balance currently in that budget. On page 45 is the Property Development Fund. We've budgeted to receive $500,000 from sale of borough property that is in the plan for fiscal year 2017. These funds will then, they're part of the payment plan that we are going to sell some borough property and use those funds for the municipal building project renovation. So that will be happening in 2017. Transient room tax fund can be found on page 46. I'm going to talk more about that fund in a minute. The E911 surcharge fund on page 47. This is the $2 surcharge you find on your phone bills each month. This special fund is for the operation, maintenance, and improvement of the borough's enhanced 911 emergency communication system. And lastly, on page 48, contains the Borough Organizational Fund. This is the money that we got from the state in between 3 years of $600,000 We use the majority of it for assessment services outside Service Area 1 and the comprehensive plan. The main expenses for fiscal year 2017 is for mapping and zoning and land entitlement costs. Is there any questions? So, like I said, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the transit room tax fund. So this is a new special revenue fund. The transit room tax used to go directly into the general fund, but it was, you couldn't really tell by looking at the budget because the general fund budget is so big. We were using that revenue to help fund the community, the Chamber of Commerce Visitors Center, and we were also giving grants. You remember every year people would apply for grants, like that fountain out there that just got put in, probably got over $20,000 in grants of transit room tax funds for that. We decided to move it into a special revenue fund for more transparency. We normally take in about $55,000, or $55,000 since we've became a borough. The chamber is requesting $40,000, and the purpose of the funding is for visitor-related services to the borough. So underneath this fund, I just wanted to point out, because we're going to be talking about this on Monday, and I'm going to provide more information on Monday, but just to get you thinking, the Clausen Museum has requested $42,000 out of the general fund budget. Petersburg Mental Health Services, $85,000. KFSK, $19,000. Mountain View Food Services, $12,000. Those are currently in the general fund balanced budget. Wave just a week or two ago requested money. I'd already put the budget out, so that's another item that we're going to have to, the Assembly's going to have to consider. I just wanted to talk about that briefly because all of those nonprofits are going to be invited on Monday to talk, and questionnaires have been sent out to them to fill out for the packet. I've gotten a few back. They're going to be in the packet, and if you have anything else in particular you want to see, let me know, and we'll have that in the packet as well. The only nonprofit that I could see that might fit into, use of the transit room tax funds could be the museum, because of tourists, visiting the museum. But maybe KFSK. I don't know. They have the community calendar and events happening, but anyway, just to let you know that that's there.
There's going to be a public hearing on the second. That'd be the better time to approach that, a second meeting. Thank you.
A lot of transients use Wi-Fi at the library.
Right, so all that can be discussed in the public comment period.
Good thought. So this is my last slide. Spring budget process, community services budget will be, again, like I said, March 7th. The budget must be approved in 3 readings. They're scheduled for these dates, but could be changed. We don't have to have the budget approved until June 15th per the borough charter. And I'd be happy to answer questions, or if you have any questions for me or department heads, or at a later time, or if you want to drill down on a particular budget at a later time, we could talk about that too. Just let me know.
Okay. At this point, does anybody on the assembly feel like they'd want to have another assembly meeting just to address one enterprise fund or the general fund or anything in particular on this budget as it's presented to us, or are we good with just moving through the ordinance process with 3 readings? I don't see anybody putting their hand up to have another special meeting, so thanks, Jody, unless there's questions of Jody.
Thanks for taking the time, Jody. Much appreciated.
So now are we going to move on to the second half? It'll be Mr. Hagerman, the motor pool.
In transition, Mr. Mayor, I'd also like to just thank the department heads for their work in understanding this time of physical responsibility that they need to cut their budgets, and I think they've done a great job on, trying to trim what they can and where they can. At some point, I'm sure we're going to get a comment from the public that our budgets are just too low now. It's totally unacceptable. The services need to be increased. So, but in the meantime, I think we'll just keep kind of going where we're going, and I appreciate the manager and everybody for all their diligent work.
Yeah, I have to. There's been a lot of thought gone into the process, and I think in the back of all of our minds, we're wondering what the final cuts are going to be from the state. And then, if Jody's already got it figured out, we'll have to possibly have a supplemental budget hearing. So, anyway, with that being said, thanks, Carl.
We don't get some fancy handout?
There should be slides in your packet for the meeting. Isn't that right?
Oh, here.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So all the slides that I've got for you today should be in your packet. Some of you have seen this presentation in the past, but essentially just wanted to take the opportunity to go through the motor pool and how it operates, what we do on a daily basis throughout the year, and also to focus on replacement recommendations for this year and how that all works. My slides aren't nearly as pretty as Jody's. I apologize, but I wanted to save some ink when I did the packet. So,
You're trimming your budget?
yeah, that's right. So essentially, the motor pool exists to provide professional and competitive procurement, maintenance, repair, disposal of transportation and construction equipment in a manner that makes sure that all the departments are safe and economical. Our customers are the other departments of the borough. We don't have an open shop where we do work for the community. It's the other departments that are our customers. So we provide all the facilities, labor, and support for operation and maintenance of those vehicles, as well as the support for replacing equipment and surplusing equipment when that arrives. I want to break this up into two parts. The first, I'll go through the operation and maintenance of the motor pool and talk about everything on the left part of this slide, and then after that we'll get into the replacement process. So our job is to take care of the fleet, and we have several different categories of fleet equipment. There are active units, the ones that are actually in use from day to day, and also included in our replacement program. We have surplus units that are waiting to be sold. Essentially, they're not in use anymore and will be sold at auction. We have reserve units that are units that have been replaced, but we have retained them for very low use assignments if they're in decent enough shape to hold up for a while, but they are not in the replacement program. We're not contributing to the replacement any longer. We have historical units, which are essentially the old fire trucks out at Scow Bay, and we have various small tools and equipment that are just in support of various operations of the borough. To go through the active units, I wanted to point out what volume of units are in each department. So the fire department has 10 different units, various fire trucks, ambulances, response vehicles. Community development has 1. Parks and Rec has 6 in support of parks maintenance, facilities maintenance, the cemetery, youth programs, that sort of thing. Motor pool has 1 flatbed. The police department has 4 all-wheel drive SUVs. We'll have shortly, we still have a couple sedans, or a sedan in service, but that will be replaced soon. The harbor has 4 units overall, 2 pickups, and we have the 2 outboard motors on the security boat in the replacement program. We track those separately. The Power and Light has 10 units, mostly for line maintenance, meter reading. The electrician has a pickup, mechanic has a pickup, administration, backhoe, various things that they need to fulfill their obligations to the community and utility. Water department has 5 units. The wastewater department has 7 units. The Vector truck, which is actually used by several departments, is assigned to wastewater, but most everything else of theirs is specifically for wastewater use. Public Works has by far the largest fleet. We have the large duty of keeping our roads and other infrastructure maintained. So there's a long list of items there. They all come in handy, and because we live on an island, it's always nice to have those tools in the toolbox when you don't have a neighboring community that can just drive it across the property line and help you out. Sanitation has 7 units, 3 garbage trucks and recycling trucks, pickup, forklift, front end loader, and we put the baler belt in our replacement program quite a few years ago because it is a substantial expense when that does wear out. This helps us build money for that replacement. The hospital, we actually are helping to maintain and replace the elderly van at the hospital. And Mountain View Manor has 2 units now with the new ADA passenger van and maintenance SUV. So items that are actually in use but not included in the replacement program, we have 1 reserve unit right now. There's a small track excavator that Parks and Rec uses at the cemetery, and there are 3 historical units in the fire department. And a lot of the small tools and equipment that we have, such as ATVs, trailers, generators, cranes, that sort of thing, are not in the replacement program either. So if those things break or wear out, it's a capital expense to the department that owns them to replace them. The staffing in the motor pool hasn't changed for a few years. We've got 2 mechanics, one foreman and 1 mechanic. In this current year, the wages and benefits for those 2 employees is $190,000. The administration, basically myself and office support, are not included in the motor pool budget. The shop rate is it's part of our business. We run it. The motor pool is an internal service fund, so we run it as a business to serve our customers, which are the other departments. Anytime that we work on a piece of equipment, we charge a rate for our time in the shop to that piece of equipment, and that bill goes out to the department that owns that piece of equipment. How we arrive at the shop rate is by taking all of the expenses for the motor pool, dividing that by billable hours. It's a fairly simple formula. In this year, FY16, there was $264,000 that needed to be supported by a labor rate.
Hey, Carl.
Yes.
What's that average out to per hour, roughly?
$85.
How much?
85.
85, yeah.
That's our rate, and then I'll go over that here shortly. So again, this is an explanation. You just take those shop expenses, divide by billable hours, which is hours that we can actually assign to a piece of equipment, and you come out with your labor rate. Another thing to point out is the expenses that go into this formula don't include items that we bill directly to the departments, like fuel and parts and insurance. All those things aren't covered by the shop rate. So, for the last 6-7 years, we've been at $85 an hour. We're proposing to maintain that rate in this next fiscal budget, and the other shops in town are right around the same amount, $85 to $90 an hour. So at least we feel we're competitive with the other mechanics in town. Some of the direct charges, let's just talk about that briefly. Fuel has really gone up and down, or actually more up than down, over the last 15 years. This is some actual expenses for fuel that we've seen. In 2000, we budgeted, or actually spent $28,000 on fuel, and then 10 years later, in 2010, we were $100,000 over that, mostly just from rising fuel costs per gallon. And that started to come back down. Of course, everybody's seeing that at the pump, although we still have budgeted fairly high to make sure that we don't run out of money, and we can keep the fleet and fuel during a heavy winter or other, if for some reason the fuel prices spike again, which is not likely.
Cindy, have a question?
Just to clarify, we're whispering over here.
Mm-hmm.
The bill to departments on a monthly basis is the portion of the FY, not that you're billing
Their actual fuel
120,000 a
use.
year.
Right,
month.
yeah. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, that whatever the departments use at the fueling facility, that's what gets billed, yeah.
So do you, I mean, it'd be kind of hard to even go out for a bid when you only have one fuel supplier in town, so how do you?
We used to actually bid when we had two, but right now the sole supplier in Petersburg actually still gives the borough a discount of 27 cents a gallon, I think, on fuel and diesel and gas, I should say. So they've maintained that discount even though there isn't any competition, and it does help out quite a bit.
I know that was something that we had looked into earlier about getting our own ISO bladders up here, but you know, it would be really difficult to have that much fuel on hand in case there was an emergency. And these guys, what, they keep a 40,000, 50,000 in reserve for you guys? What was that number?
I can't remember.
It was
a
a significant
pretty
amount of fuel that
healthy.
they set aside specifically for the borough, I know, in case of emergency. Something.
And they have the right facility to contain that amount of fuel. It would be costly to set up our own tank farm for sure. So all of the borough vehicles fill up at the motor pool. We have our own tanks and pumps, but it's secure. They have to enter in their own. The driver has to enter in a number and password. That information is input into our computer, and that's how we get that monthly billing. It tells us who got gas, when they got it, how much they got, and so we can bill that out. And this also mentions the discount that we get from Petromarine. Parts are another thing that we charge directly to the departments without a markup. We use our inventory line item in the motor pool. It's a fairly large number, usually 90,000. I think it's 90,000 proposed for FY17. But every part that we order comes out of that line item, and then we bill that to the department and get that revenue back to the motor pool. We also do rely on local parts suppliers quite a bit. Napa and Petersburg Motors help us out with many parts. Insurance is something the motor pool also takes care of for the vehicles. On an annual basis, we do a review and look at the policies for all the rolling stock, making sure that the policy is up to date and makes sense as far as what we're doing to insure those vehicles. Most units that we have just carry liability, but some of the higher priced or public safety vehicles do have a comprehensive coverage. Preventive maintenance, kind of moving on in the program, is a major part of our work in the motor pool is making sure that the vehicles and equipment that the borough purchases last a long time, are reliable for the departments, and that when an employee needs a vehicle to do a job, it's there, and also it extends their lives. We get more value out of a vehicle when it operates for longer and is in good shape. Safer for everyone. We rely on a computer system, a CFA, computerized fleet analysis, to track all of the maintenance that are done on our equipment and vehicles. So the mechanics, they submit daily work orders, let us know the hours they spent on a piece of equipment, what they did, how it went, any parts that they used, those costs. That all goes into the computer. So the CFA tracks all of that maintenance and maintains that ongoing O&M cost for every vehicle that we have, which is actually pretty valuable when you're looking at replacement when a vehicle gets to the end of its life cycle and you want to know how much you've spent, and if you're seeing a rising cost. That's very useful. So that's kind of the basis of the O&M side of the motor pool. Are there any questions about that before I move into the replacement side?
Any questions? Kurt?
Carl, is your mechanics trained to use computers now to plug into the vehicles that you now have, or is that something that you still outsource to Petersburg Motors?
No, it's part of our daily lives now. I can't say that we're really good at it, but it's something that we have the equipment. All the new trucks, even the heavy equipment that comes out now, are totally computer-based, PLC-driven, and so you have to have that knowledge to be able to see what's going on with these engines. It's very hard to just pick up a wrench and go at it anymore. You've got to see what the computer in the engine tells you before you can actually start in a lot of cases. So.
Right. I mean, I'm not being critical of the age of our employees up there, but some of them are probably getting close to retirement age, and I wondered if that was something that you're working with maybe the school, maybe to have some of these younger men that are, or women, who's ever qualified to be able to go to these schools, maybe to come back with this knowledge, that they could then work locally, in the city shop. I wonder if that's something, because everything's gone computer now. And you just plug a little thing in and it tells you what you got to do. And if they're like me, it has to be a simple, mechanical, kind of a thing, for me to work on them. So.
Right. Oh, that's a great idea. The motor pool has not done that, and I'm not sure what the potential for programs with the school would be, but that could be something to look into.
Yeah. Good.
Any other questions before he moves on to the replacement part?
So on replacement, we'll start going through that.
Carl,
Yes.
Just to jump in for the Assembly's benefit, motor pool gets, between questions to me and questions to Carl, this is one of those areas that gets a lot of attention by the public and by various Assembly members. So this is an opportunity, if you see a policy or how we're doing this, to say, change it or suggest a change. That's one of the reasons I asked Carl to do this presentation, is a way for the Assembly to basically take a look. This is how these decisions are made when it comes to vehicle replacement. Now's a really good chance to say, you either like it or you don't. And if you don't, what do you want us to change it to, or have questions for us? So what I'm trying to say is we would enjoy your comments on this. This is a way to maybe get this square for everybody.
I like to add, absolutely, if there's any comments or any desires to change this program, I'd love to discuss it with you folks. But in the past, we had a motor pool advisory committee where a lot of these policies were defined and established, and it's been quite some time since we've had that committee. And I think the direction when it was dissolved was that the motor pool would deal directly with the Assembly on any changed policies. So certainly, if there's any questions or concerns, now would be a good time, or any time, honestly. But so our replacement program is geared to maintain a really high level of reliability and safety for the departments. It depends on forward funding our purchases. It's when you as a private individual go and look for a car, if you don't have the cash balance in your bank account, you look at getting a loan. And we do not do that. We forward fund so that the money is in an account when we go to buy. We don't have to go to any financing outfit to be able to purchase that equipment. In the past, before this was set up, it would have to be not only probably financed, but an annual debate in the budget process of, okay, the fire department wants a fire truck, it's going to cost this much, and there would be this discussion at the council level at the time of whether or not that was a good decision or not. And this replacement program doesn't eliminate that completely, but because we're forward funding and we have that balance there, it sure makes it an easier decision financially at times. There are plenty of other variables that go into the decision to replace, but at least the financial part of it is generally solved when it comes up.
Well, Carl, can I know you and I have talked in the past there, and you've actually been asking for less funds now from enterprise funds and these people that have these vehicles for forward funding. Can you maybe tell the public, what you guys used to ask, different departments to contribute versus what you're asking them now to contribute? Because I know you've reduced that request.
Hopefully I can say this without getting too confusing, but essentially we track every vehicle with a humongous spreadsheet, and it tells us, and a lot of this will come out in the presentation, but it tells us what that department should be contributing every year to fully fund that vehicle. When we started the program, I'd call that the ideal contribution amount. When we started the program, we really shot for that ideal so that we could build that for every vehicle. Well, over time, because we have a fleet that's 80 vehicles or so, the balance in the overall fund has grown to the point where every single vehicle may not need to have that ideal balance, because the fund overall can fund a replacement. In 2017, we're not going to replace 80 vehicles. We're going to replace 7. So that balance doesn't need to be spent all in one year. Those purchases are spread out. So what we've found is that we can decrease the amount of contributions every year for every specific vehicle, depending on what department it is, and start to spend down this large fund balance that we have, and actually save the department's money in their budget. The general fund departments actually are contributing about 40% of what that ideal balance would be, which is it's a pretty significant savings. And we're still in great shape as far as the fund balance goes and being able to replace equipment when we need to. It's kind of a shift in looking at how we use that fund, as opposed to looking at every vehicle separately and, we only got $10,000 to replace a $12,000 vehicle. We can't do it. Now we're looking at $4 million to replace that $10,000 vehicle. So it's just a different way to do it, but it's allowed us to drop the contribution rates and save some money in departments' budgets. Does that make sense?
Clearly, thank you.
So the replacement account at the end of last fiscal year was about $4.7 million. The annual contributions are calculated for each unit in the fleet, and like I said, we look at an ideal balance and then we discount that. It's not really easy to explain, but essentially the goal is to spend down that balance, but still have enough to sustain a solid, strong replacement program in the future. So every month my office sends out a billing notice actually to the user departments, our customers, so that they can transfer the money into the replacement fund. And those contributions are based on expected lifespan of the unit and the total cost that we need to amass before we go to replace it. So this is an example of, and this would be the ideal contribution amount. You take the replacement cost, which is basically the original, or to find the replacement cost, you take the original purchase price and you add 3% per year for the expected lifespan of the vehicle. So the example here is a $20,000 purchase at a 10-year lifespan. You compound that 3%. You plan to replace that vehicle at $26,878, because that's adding that inflation in there. If you didn't add the inflation in, you'd never achieve that replacement cost. And we've seen that 3% actually holds pretty true to what we need. There's some vehicles like fire trucks have actually shot way above that. But overall, the majority of our fleet, that 3% inflation gives us what we need planning-wise to replace that. And here again, I mentioned this 40 to 100% of ideal vehicle contributions. That's all based on trying to maintain that fund, not continue to grow it out of control for no reason, but to control it and spend it down and still have a strong program. the finance department, just a note here, that they treat the replacement as one singular fund. It's basically all the money goes into one account. The motor pool tracks every different department, every vehicle in our big, huge spreadsheet. So we keep a really close eye on where that money is and where it goes. It's confusing for sure when you replace things in the middle of the year or you surplus stuff out. That money that comes back in for revenue for that needs to be put back into the fund, and it'll go to that one vehicle that it replaced. The finance department, it's easy for them. They transfer that money into the fund and they're done. But we have to figure out not only put it in the right spot in our spreadsheet, but how does that affect the payments going forward to replace that vehicle in the long run. We've got it figured out, but it can be confusing. So the replacement process, I wanted to go over that. There essentially is no automatic replacement. If a vehicle gets to the end of its expected lifespan, it's evaluated. There's no mechanism in place for it automatically to just end up in the budget. The lifespans that we look at, for these vehicles of the borough, light-duty vehicles, pickups, and SUVs and such, typically 10 to 12 years are what we expect to get out of those. Police units are the shortest. They get a lot of miles on them, and they're very important to have those things working reliably. So we look at typically 4 to 6 years lifespan on those. Fire trucks, on the other hand, are very important to maintain, but they see relatively small use. So we can generally get 20 to 25 years out of a fire truck. And then the higher use or high reliability heavy trucks, such as garbage trucks and the power and light line trucks, will pretty strictly put a 10-year lifespan on those, just because by the end of that time period, it's generally almost a foregone conclusion that it'll need to be replaced, although we still go through the process to evaluate whether it really does or not. And then our heavy equipment, we can generally get 15 to 25 years out of heavy construction equipment. So after we look at the lifespan, we calculate that replacement cost, what that number we're shooting for, and then we start billing the department those contributions on a monthly basis. And then any revenue that we get back when the old vehicle that's been replaced is sold goes back into the fund. So during the lifespan of the vehicle, we have regularly scheduled preventive maintenance tasks performed, and that just ensures reliability, safety, and extends the life of all our vehicles. Just wanted to say that rarely do units fail to meet their expected lifespan. Generally, we extend vehicles regularly every year, and it's rare that they don't meet that first lifespan estimate. If there is a major failure, it's generally always after we've already extended the unit. So once the unit's projected life cycle comes to an end, we know we put a 10-year lifespan on it, and we're at year 9.5. We start the budget process. The mechanics will inspect and evaluate that vehicle and take a close look at it and make a recommendation whether or not the maintenance required is at a low enough level that we can conceivably get some more years out of it without a large cost, or if the maintenance looks to be extensive, then we take a closer look. So we look at other factors for replacement, maintenance history. If we're having a recurring problem with the same thing, basically a lemon, that we just for whatever reason the design isn't very good, and it just keeps failing. Ford had a problem with their diesel engines a few years ago that we ran into a few problems like that with them. Residual value versus maintenance costs. If the maintenance that is required to keep the vehicle safe is more than 70% of the residual value, the Blue Book value, we generally recommend to replace it. Also considering the trade-in value on the older units. If there's still a decent amount of trade-in value or resale value, and it's kind of on the borderline of maintenance costs, then generally we'll try to replace it to get that value, some value out of that old unit before it's all gone. Reliability obviously is a big issue. We want to make sure that reliability, depending on its assignment, is where it needs to be. Safety, the units all have to be safe. Some are more important than others. Line trucks need to be certified every year for insulation value, so that if they work in a high voltage, the trucks are insulated and protect those around it. So if that is a concern at the end of the 10-year lifespan for one of those, then generally we'll look at replacing it. Obviously, the cost of the new unit, if our inflationary adjustment every year is not going to make it. For instance, if we calculated that a replacement would be $50,000, but the actual market value of the replacement is $75,000, then it takes us, we obviously take a closer look at that and see if can we squeak this out for a couple more years and get the money that we need in hand before we go to replace. So that comes into play. And the actual use of the unit, if it's a really high use unit or critical in nature to our operations, then we'll err on the safe side and replace it. Although if it's a low use piece of equipment, has issues but isn't going to be used that much, then we'll probably extend it. When we do extend vehicles, we also recommend a time period. Generally, they're fairly low. There is a risk when we extend a vehicle that it won't get to the end of that extension period. So we generally make them low extension periods. But again, even when they get to that period, it's not an automatic replacement. We go through the whole process again of evaluating what the condition of that vehicle is at the time. We do have to, when we extend, basically the majority of the money, again, the goal was to contribute funds towards that replacement at the end of its life cycle, so at the end of 10 years, say. If we extend it for 2 more years, the same amount of contribution that we use the first 10 years isn't, if we keep contributing that same amount, we're going to overshoot that. So generally, if we extend, we can also drop the annual contributions, which saves departments money. So after a replacement recommendation is arrived at by the motor pool, it goes through the manager's office and then obviously ends up in front of the assembly, mostly during the budgetary process, although in the last year you've had a couple supplemental requests from me to deal with due to failures. So I apologize for that, but all of those were units that had been extended and just didn't make it to the end of their extension period. A couple different ways to actually purchase the replacement. The one way that I've landed on more so recently is cooperative purchasing agreements. It's very streamlined. The pricing is offered as a result of a competitive bid process at some point, but it is just a lot smoother for my office to make a purchase through that. And still expect a low price for the piece of equipment. I've got a graph here. This is a historic graph of replacements and extensions, and it's interesting to look at this. The replacements go up and down depending on it. It's really just based on life cycle. When I started as the director, we were replacing quite a few vehicles, extending very few. But as those life cycles went on in history, the extensions started to increase, and basically those vehicles that we bought in '02 got to the end of their life, and instead of replacing them, we extended them. the point where we in 2014 and 2015 we extended 28 vehicles in that, of course, of that 2 years, and now that's starting to drop a little bit, and the replacements are starting to rise in the last few years, and it's a function of life cycles and how those vehicles eventually wear out, and we have to replace them. But you can see that probably the average life cycle for all our vehicles are 10 years. We're way past 10 years as far as that rising replacement trend. So I think that's a result of the preventive maintenance program that we have in place, and prudent replacement extension recommendations. So I'll just really go through this quickly. It's the bid process that we have gone through traditionally takes a long time to develop a full specification for a fire truck or basically any piece of heavy equipment. It takes a lot of time. It's basically you have to go through the entire vehicle and lay out every single item that you want on that or need on that. And you work with the department heads, you work with the drivers, the people that are going to be operating the piece of equipment to come up with that spec. And then, of course, you advertise that spec for 2 to 4 weeks, and then you receive bids, award that bid, that process, and then after it's approved, hopefully approved by the assembly, to the low bidder, place the order, and that takes another lengthy period of time. So that for the complicated equipment, that process can last 10 to 11 months, even longer sometimes, typically 6 months. The cooperative purchasing, although it's still lengthy, we can cut a couple months off of that just from eliminating that the bid period and the specification development phase, and it really has streamlined things. And for the lighter duty equipment, it really cuts down on the time of delivery. After a unit is replaced, we do have a process to sell our equipment. Generally, it's if the equipment is not traded in, which sometimes happens, traded into the vendor, it's sold by auction, either a public outcry or sealed bid locally, and generally we get good responses to local auctions when we hold them, and we'll have a pretty sizable one this spring. We've got a number of surplus equipment that we need to get rid of. I wanted to go through an example of a replacement consideration and use the sanitation's large garbage truck. So this truck is a combination of automated side loader and a rear loading garbage packer. It's a very large piece of equipment. It allows us to pick up all the automated cans on the routes, but also to pick up the rear load dumpsters that we have around town. It was bought specifically with that in mind. There is a cab conversion that allows for stand-up driving on the right-hand side of the vehicle, so if the driver has to get out numerous times a day to move a can or pick up something, it's safer for them and results in much fewer workers' comp injuries. This unit is used daily, and it is a very large piece of equipment that we found that we didn't need it to be that large. So we're looking at replacing this vehicle with a smaller vehicle that does not have the rear load tailgate on it. So this truck was bid and awarded in 2007. It cost $250,000 when it was new. The cost to replace this truck with the same size and configuration next year would be about $350,000, and that figure is somewhat shocking, especially if you know there's a way you can do the same job with a truck that costs $220,000. We've gone to a different way of collecting many of our commercial customers, the rear load dumpsters will be phased out slowly. We'll still have one truck in our fleet that collect the rear load dumpsters, but we're going to try to push people to the large 300-gallon garbage cans and recycle cans, which the side loading trucks can collect. And that will be the goal with this replacement, is to buy another side loading truck. So all the components that are evaluated when looking at this unit for replacement. In a nutshell, the unit it's been a good unit. It's really showed us what we can do as far as efficiency in using a side loader, but it's used up. The garbage packing components on it are fairly worn out. So the residual value is, the chassis may have some value to a buyer, but the garbage packer, and the side loader need to be essentially replaced for them to be a good buy for someone. The budgetary pricing for the new unit, the replacement, smaller side loader, is known because we just bought one. So that's handy to throw in the mix when we're considering replacement. It's used every day. It needs to be highly reliable. It needs to be safe. The maintenance costs on the old unit are quite high. The side loading arm requires a lot of maintenance. But we do have the funding in the replacement account to replace it. And so if the recommendation is approved by the Assembly, we'll seek a final quote through a cooperative purchasing contract, work with the manufacturer to get a purchase order in place, and this build will probably take anywhere from 180 to 210 days before the truck is delivered. If it's not approved, we'd extend the unit 1 year. I would probably have to increase the sanitation's maintenance budget for motor pool to account for additional maintenance costs of the old unit. As I said, it's pretty well used up. We'd have to make sure that the money will be there next year to replace it if it makes it that far. So that's my presentation on replacement. I'll talk about the specific recommendations here in a second, but just a final blurb on the motor pool. Really wants to do a good job for our departments, the user departments of the borough, and make sure that we stretch those equipment dollars as well as we can through the preventive maintenance program and a prudent replacement recommendation process. So in this upcoming
Carl,
year,
I have a quick
yes.
question. So just, we're talking about the dump or the garbage truck, since we're on that topic. After 10 years, how many miles or how many hours are on do you have an hour meter on those engines?
There is an
Just
hour meter on that, and the miles aren't significantly high because of the road system
Right.
that we're on. It's really the starting and stopping 500 times a day that really wears that thing out. We've replaced brakes on it numerous times. We've had to rebuild or weld on the arm significantly a couple times, and replace major components a couple times. It's the repetitive nature of its assignment that really eats them up, and the material that they're dealing with is everything from soup to nuts. So it's just the material itself. When you dump garbage into a steel container and move it around, it's going to wear stuff out. So
I'm just kind of curious what kind of hours were built up.
Yeah,
Thought if you knew, it'd be.
I don't have that off the top of my head. So these are the specific replacement recommendations for FY17. We've got a Parks and Rec pickup, a pickup, an F-250 in water, another SUV for the police department, 2 units for power and light, administrator's SUV, and the meter readers pickup. the meter reader's pickup was already failed. It's sitting in the motor pool yard. Transmission went out, and it's not worth buying a $2,000 or $3,000 transmission for that truck. So there it sits, and we're making do in the meantime until the budget rolls around. The sanitation truck is right there, and we're looking at replacing the backup ambulance for the fire department. How that would work is we would replace the backup ambulance with a new one. The new one would then become the primary, and the existing primary would take the backup role, just to keep the newest ambulance as the first responder. So that total recommended replacement budget for FY17 is $547,000.
Or if we spend that, how much is left in the motor pool fund?
The balance was what, 4.7, so over 4 million still. And these are the recommended extensions. We've got a fire truck that will extend for another year, public works utility van, and wash truck we can extend for another year. The Parks and Rec box van, we can get a couple more years out of that. It's in pretty good shape. There's a pickup at wastewater that we can get easily another year out of. Harbor pickup, easily another year, and the outboards on the Homeland Security boat were up for replacement this next year, but they're doing pretty well too. So there's a significant amount of value in this list that we are not recommending to replace in FY17. So I did not go into the weeds in the motor pool budget, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Most of this was about the operation of the.
Cindy, you have a question?
Are you able to use, because I saw at one point you had lease as a line item, and it seems like there may be some vehicles that get intermittent use. They're necessary, but you don't use them frequently, and it might be cheaper not to own the vehicle, but to rent one if one was available locally. Are you able to do that, or do you do that?
We don't do it much. It's an option that has never really worked out. Generally, what we have done is PIA had a brush cutter that we rented, for the summer months. They would use it in the winter for snow removal, and we would use it in the summer for brush cutting. Mm-hmm. Which worked okay. We're renting an ATV sidewalk plow from this winter, which has worked out pretty good for us and them, honestly, because it was just sitting in their garage. They got some money for it, and we haven't had to use it much. So the larger pieces of equipment, the lease rates are actually fairly high. So unless you have a specific project that you're going to launch into, it's not cost effective to have something just sitting around.
Okay. Well, I was thinking the first thing that came to mind was the excavator for the cemetery, but that is not even a replacement vehicle. That's outside of this program, isn't it?
Right. Right now, that the small one that's at the cemetery all the time is in reserve. So, yeah, it's costing us a little bit of maintenance money, but not a whole lot.
And then a follow-up to that is cooperative use between departments. How much of that is happening or can happen in the future?
It happens quite a bit. Where equipment, if the public works backhoe is at not being used and the wastewater department needs to spread some rock or something like that, they'll come and grab it, and it actually works out very well. There used to be a dedicated backhoe in water and wastewater for line orders and stuff. Well, that's gone away. We've only got one now, and it's shared, and it's working out well. So there are opportunities like that. The Vector truck is a prime example of many departments using that one truck to great benefit. It's a fantastic piece of equipment, and no sense in having more than one, but it's very useful for many departments. We also have what's called a swap loader truck, a roll-off truck. It's basically a chassis that is able to pick up different beds. We use it to deliver water. Mm-hmm. We also use it to haul sludge in a different tank.
So relieved to hear that.
It picks up the large dumpsters in the harbor, and other beds can be purchased to use it further. But those are the uses that it covers now. So some of that happens.
Kurt?
Carl, this may also be a question for Jody. This is probably not directly related to the motor pool, but you have $4.2 million or $4.7 million in your budget reserves. How much is that is invested, and what kind of interest are we getting on that money?
I don't have any information on that.
Jody?
It's all invested, and it's in fixed assets, so very, very low interest rate, probably maybe making about 1% right now.
Any other questions of Carl?
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, that's informative.
Thanks for your work, Carl.
Yes.
So, any other questions of Jody that popped into anybody's mind while we're going through the motor pool presentation? We can have more time to discuss this, but no?
I have a question overall, backing up.
Sure.
It's appropriate. And I direct that one at Steve. I see you have in here $90,000 for contingency for next year. It's in your control, which is higher than what you had, a little bit higher than you had this year, and definitely higher than what you had a year ago.
Yeah, we started off a few years ago with adding a $90,000 contingency in the general fund, and we did that. It's kind of a safety net. It's things that come up. As I put pressure on department heads to cut their budgets, one of the biggest pushbacks was there are certain things we just don't know what's going to happen, and now you're looking at this massive supplemental budget process to deal with something that you might have padded your budget before to deal with that. So instead, I've asked them, let's eliminate a lot of that, but we'll back you up. We'll put some money in the general fund. Purely, they're saying, we don't know if we're going to need this, and we allow any of the general fund departments to pull from that with going through the normal process. Doesn't have to be 90,000. That was just a magical number that we could afford, 3 or 4 years ago when we did it, and in subsequent years, in times we've had to lower it because trying to keep the budget in balance. This year, with a lot of cuts that we made in the general fund, we had enough to put it back at 90. I wish it could be more, to be honest with you, mainly because I put so much pressure on department heads to cut that they can have one event occur and that their budgets can't absorb it. So that contingency becomes a place for them to say, hey, Steve, I don't have the money to pay for this, but I've got 4 broken windows or, something that we have to get replaced. So again, it's not a requirement but there are ramifications if that number isn't there at all.
First year it was almost 40,000, then it jumped to 90 or 80-some thousand. Now it's up to 90.
Yeah.
That's just a guess on your part on what we could afford.
It's pure guesswork. I tell you, at least at this point, Jody, how much of that have we used going last 2 years?
This year, I don't think we've used any. Last year, I don't have my budget right in front of me like I should.
Boilers in there.
But, was that this year though or last year?
I think that was.
It was right around,
Yeah.
I think, that year end, so I don't know if it got put in last year's or this year's, but the boilers breaking at the aquatic center, that was something we just couldn't wait on.
So that's a great example of the kind of things we would use that money for.
And then is the 16,000 contingency you show in the harbor fund, is that then in addition to or included in that 90,000?
Now that is an additional number that the harbor wanted to put into their budget for similar types of events. And this goes back to me arguing with Glow a few years ago. I think it had to do with one of the ramps, the boarding ramps. And suddenly, oops, we needed to do repairs on the surface, and they hadn't budgeted for it. So I suggested to her she might want to consider a contingency line item similar to what we were doing in the general fund.
And is that contingency then based on your approval to spend it, or how is that?
No.
How's that being operated?
Now, in the harbor, the department heads have a spending authority up to $5,000 that they can spend on their own. They have to send the bill through and get it signed off on. Currently, under the purchasing agreement, I can spend up to 30 without going back to the assembly.
Thank you.
Any other questions of the manager or Carl or Jody? I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.